Welcome to Future Epoch, where we learn more about our world. Every year, a city of 10 million people sinks a little further beneath the surface of the Earth. Not slowly in some distant geological sense, but measurably, visibly within a human lifetime. In North Jakarta, entire neighborhoods have dropped more than 2.5 meters in the past decade. Roads that once sat above the waterline now flood without any rain at all. Mosques, schools and factories stand partially submerged, their lower floors long abandoned to the tide. Jakarta is one of the fastest sinking cities on Earth. And the response to that crisis is one of the most ambitious and most contested infrastructure projects ever proposed in Southeast Asia. Jakarta sits at sea level on the northern coast of Java, built across a delta fed by 13 rivers flowing down from the mountains to the south. The land is soft, waterlogged, and unstable. For centuries, that was manageable. Today, it is not. The city is home to around 10 million people within the city boundaries and roughly 30 million across the broader metropolitan region, making it one of the most densely populated urban areas on the planet. It is the economic and administrative heart of Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous country. What happens to Jakarta matters well beyond its own coastline. The flooding that now defines daily life in the city's northern districts is the product of two compounding forces. The first is land subsidence, the ground itself sinking, primarily because millions of residents and businesses pump groundwater from beneath the city to meet their basic daily needs. As that water is extracted, the layers of clay and sediment above compact and settle. In the worst affected parts of North Jakarta, the land has subsided at rates of up to 25 centimeters per year. The second force is sea level rise driven by climate change, which is pushing the ocean steadily upward against a coastline that is simultaneously dropping. The result is a closing gap. Jakarta is not waiting for some future catastrophe. The catastrophe is already underway. The idea of protecting Jakarta's coastline with engineered barriers is not new. The Dutch, who colonized the region for 3 centuries and who understand flood control as well as any nation on Earth, had proposed coastal defenses for Jakarta's bay as far back as the colonial period. But it was not until the early 2010s that the scale of the problem and the scale of the proposed solution both became clear at the same time. In 2014, a consortium of Dutch engineering firms and the Indonesian government jointly unveiled the National Capital Integrated Coastal Development Project, known by its acronym NCICD. The plan was extraordinary in its ambition. It proposed constructing a 32-kilometer seawall across Jakarta Bay, enclosing a lagoon between the wall and the existing coastline. Behind this outer barrier, a freshwater reservoir would be created, allowing the rivers that flow through the city to drain freely without backing up against the rising sea. Reclaimed land along the wall would provide space for new residential and commercial development, helping to finance the entire project through private investment. The outer wall was designed in the shape of a Garuda, the mythical bird that serves as Indonesia's national symbol, a form visible from the air and intended as a statement of national purpose and permanence. Estimated costs for the full project ran to $40 billion or more. Phase A, the first component, involved reinforcing and raising the existing inner coastal defenses, approximately 13 kilometers of seawalls and embankments along the northern shoreline. This work proceeded through the 2010s, funded in part through government budgets and supported by the World Bank. But Phase B and Phase C, the outer giant sea wall and the enclosed lagoon, remained unfunded, contested and unbuilt. Progress slowed under successive Indonesian administrations, each confronting the same structural problem. The project required enormous upfront investment with returns measured across decades, and the politics of displacing long-established coastal fishing communities to construct reclaimed islands were never straightforward. Then, in 2019, the Indonesian government made an announcement that fundamentally reframed the conversation. President Joko Widodo declared that Indonesia would move its national capital away from Jakarta entirely, relocating government functions to a new city called Nusantara on the island of Borneo. Jakarta, he said, was too congested, too flood-prone, and too environmentally degraded to continue as the nation's capital. Construction on Nusantara began in the early 2020s. The capital relocation created an immediate and uncomfortable question. If the government was moving away from Jakarta, who would pay to save it? The NCICD project had always depended on private investment in reclaimed land to cross-subsidize the seawall construction. That model required confidence that Jakarta would remain economically relevant, that property values would hold, that investors and businesses would want to be there. The announcement of the capital move introduced doubt into every one of those calculations. At the same time, critics had long argued that the seawall addressed the wrong problem. Flood engineers pointed out that the land subsidence driving Jakarta's vulnerability was caused by groundwater extraction, and that a seawall, however impressive, would do nothing to stop the city from continuing to sink. If groundwater pumping was not halted and replaced by piped water infrastructure, Jakarta would keep descending even behind a completed barrier. The lagoon would gradually shallow. The wall would need to be raised and raised again. The government had committed to extending Jakarta's piped water network as part of the broader project, but coverage remained far short of what was needed to eliminate dependence on groundwater. As of the early 2020s, large portions of the city still had no access to treated piped water at all. There was also the human dimension. North Jakarta's coastline was home to tens of thousands of people in fishing villages and informal settlements, communities that had occupied the shore for generations and whose livelihoods depended on direct access to the sea. Reclamation projects had already displaced some of them, triggering protests and legal challenges that wound through Indonesian courts for years. The balance between large-scale protective infrastructure and the rights of those it displaced was never satisfactorily resolved. The consequences of the current situation, and of continued inaction, are not speculative. They are measurable and ongoing. Flooding in Jakarta costs the Indonesian economy an estimated $3 billion per year in direct damage and economic disruption. Regular inundation corrodes infrastructure, damages property, disrupts supply chains, and forces residents into cycles of repair and recovery that consume savings and erode livelihoods across entire districts. The worst floods, when heavy seasonal rainfall combines with high tides and upstream river surges, push water into the streets of central Jakarta, not just the long-suffering northern outskirts. By the 2030s, climate projections suggest that without meaningful intervention, significant portions of North Jakarta face the risk of permanent inundation. This is not a question of annual flooding inconvenience. It represents the potential permanent loss of built urban land in one of the world's great cities. The partial seawall work completed under Phase A has provided genuine protection in localized areas. Coastal defenses in some of the most exposed sections have been raised, and early warning systems have been improved. But these measures slow the deterioration rather than reverse it. Meanwhile, the decision to build Nusantara introduces its own fiscal uncertainties. The new capital represents an enormous redirection of government funds and political attention over a period of years. Whether sufficient investment will remain available for Jakarta's long-term infrastructure, including any meaningful completion of the NCICD, is a question that has not been answered with clarity by any administration. Jakarta's story is not simply a cautionary tale about one city's mismanagement. It is an illustration of a challenge that dozens of coastal cities around the world are beginning to confront: the compounding relationship between how humans exploit the urban environment and the physical forces that exploitation makes worse. Land subsidence in Jakarta was not an act of nature. It was the direct consequence of a city growing faster than its public infrastructure, of millions of people doing what they had no alternative but to do to access water each day. The flooding that followed was not bad luck. It was an outcome embedded in choices made over decades by residents, by developers, by governments, and by the absence of systems that should have been built far earlier. The lesson is not that megaprojects like seawalls are the answer. The lesson is that the physical sustainability of a city and the social and institutional systems that govern it are inseparable. A wall built around a city that continues to extract its own ground from beneath itself is not a solution. It is a postponement, and an expensive one. Jakarta remains one of the great unresolved urban challenges of the 21st century. A city of 30 million people, indispensable to one of the world's largest economies, visibly sinking toward the sea, while the political and financial will required to arrest that process remains fragmented and uncertain. The giant seawall may yet be built, in some form, at some cost, across some future decade. Phase A is real. The Dutch expertise is available. The engineering is understood. But the harder problem, replacing groundwater extraction, connecting millions of homes to piped water, resettling communities, securing decades of consistent funding through multiple administrations, that problem has no engineering solution. It requires institutions capable of acting at the scale and on the timescale that the physics of the situation demands. So far, the sea has not waited for an answer. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.